Hello and welcome to a special edition of Decision NYC with Ben Max on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. Election Day 2022 is right around the corner, and New York is home to many important and competitive political races. Today, we're bringing you a last-minute voter guide of sorts with a rundown of what's on the ballot, major competitive races to be aware of, and analysis of the stakes of the elections happening in New York City and across the state. Those stakes include the fact that what happens in a number of New York elections for the U.S. House of Representatives will play a pivotal, if not decisive, role in which party controls the House majority when the next Congress is seated in January. Nationally, the U.S. Senate majority, also currently held by Democrats by a slim margin, will also be decided. At the top of the ticket here in New York, there are several statewide races for governor and lieutenant governor together, for attorney general, for controller, and one U.S. Senate seat. All of those positions are currently held by Democrats seeking a new full term, and each is facing a Republican opponent. More on those soon. Along with the statewide races are the 26 House contests across the state. That number is down one for New York after the latest census cost the state another seat in a decades-long drop. And those districts have shifted to account for population trends and the loss of the one seat. After a chaotic redistricting process, the lines were set, and there are many competitive races in what Republicans hope is a wave year that gets them back into the U.S. House and Senate majorities that Democrats currently hold. Every seat in the New York State legislature is also on the ballot this year. That's 213 in total, with 63 state Senate seats and 150 state assembly seats. Democrats hold supermajorities in both houses, but Republicans are trying to chip away at those margins and have some slight hope of retaking the state Senate majority either this year or in a future election cycle if they can make a dent this one. So there are many elections happening, and you have plenty to vote on. There are also some additional local races that may be on your ballot depending on where you live. So join us here for more on these races and the stakes, and make a plan to vote if you haven't yet. Early voting runs through Sunday, November 6th, and Election Day is Tuesday, November 8th. There's no voting on Monday. One more thing of note before I bring on my expert guest to help me break all this down some more. Along with the many races for elected office on the ballot this year in New York, there are important referendums for voters to consider, including one statewide ballot question and 3 others only for New York City voters. All of them are yes or no questions, but they deal with complex proposals. We broke them down on a separate show, so you can find that to get up to speed. And we also have reporting on the ballot questions at Gotham Gazette, of course. Across the state, New Yorkers have the opportunity to vote on question 1, which is the proposal for a $4.2 billion Environmental Bond Act, formerly known as the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act of 2022. As the name suggests, it would fund a number of environmental and climate-related projects across New York. Voters can approve or disapprove that. Additionally, on the ballot in New York City only, voters will be able to vote on questions 2, 3, and 4, all of which deal with potential equity-focused amendments to the New York City Charter passed by a racial justice commission assembled by former Mayor Bill de Blasio. I won't go into all the details of those right now. But let's get ready for Election Day in New York. Go over what's on the ballot, races and themes to watch, and what to know ahead of the votes being tallied and winners being announced. Joining me now is Joe Spector, the New York editor for Politico, who has deep knowledge of New York politics and the elections happening all around the state. Joe, welcome. Thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm good, Ben. I realized I was thinking about when I was going to come on. I realized this is my 6th gubernatorial race in New York.
Wow,
so,
okay.
Boy, time flies.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's but no, I mean, as you noted, this is a big one, right? I mean, there's a lot to go through. And, you know, I talk about all the elections that I've covered, but certainly not one, particularly in the gubernatorial race, where you're down to the wire, and most everybody expects a close race.
Yeah, no, let's start right there. So let's try to go through some of the statewide races and big themes, and then we'll get into some of the legislative races. So at the top of the ticket in New York, you get at this, Governor Kathy Hochul has been governor for just a little over a year. She's never won election to the office. She was lieutenant governor, took over when Governor Andrew Cuomo stepped down. She is now in a real fight here for keeping the governor's office against Republican Lee Zeldin, congressman from Long Island, Hochul from Western New York, the first upstate governor in a very long time, as she likes to say. This race is a bit closer than a lot of people expected. What do you see going on here? What's the sort of top issues that voters seem to be thinking about? Give us a sort of overview of your view of the sort of state of the race here in the final days.
Yeah, no question, Ben. I mean, you think about where this race was in the summer, and Kathy Hochul just continued to hit on Roe v. Wade, the overturning of that. She was very strong in her ads about abortion rights and Lee Zeldin being against abortion rights and hammering that, talking a lot about his ties to Trump. And so that was the real focus of her race and her ads during the summer. And seemed like it was working, just fine. I mean, Sienna came out with a poll showing up the race up 17, and most Democrats thought that, she would continue to stretch of no Republican winning a statewide office for 20 years. But here we are 6 days out, and it's changed. The polls have showed it. I don't know, depending on what you look at, 6 points, or I think it was 4 in Sienna, 4 in Quinnipiac and 11 in Sienna. So somewhere in there, let's say, maybe single digits, maybe a little more, but yeah. And so what happened here is Lee Zeldin has continued to talk about the crime issues, particularly in New York City. He's talked a lot about the high cost of living in New York. He's toured the state on that message. And as you've seen it nationally, Republicans are starting to have increasing success by focusing on the economy, focusing on crime, and that's what's happening here in New York. And so as a result, we had a story a couple of weeks ago about how Kathy Hochul pivoted. She started talking more about crime, putting up ads about her record in trying to reform some of the bail laws that are at the heart of this debate, talking about how she's fought to get illegal guns off the streets. So she's been more and more aggressive. And, you see her crisscrossing New York City every day now with this message of that she is going to fight crime and has done so. And meanwhile, Lee Zeldin is hitting, he's going to subway stations, he's going to crime scenes, talking about how they need a change and they need a tough on crime governor.
It's been really interesting. The Zeldin campaign has had this focus that you've noted, and really just this unbelievably sort of focused campaign on basically those two big issues, and then sort of assailing Hochul and Democrats on a whole number of other things that they're saying are not being done well, or not being done enough, or being done too much on a whole host of fronts. But really this incredible focus on two topics that are either reinforcing what's on voters' minds or helping through, that messaging to really make sure that those stay at the top of the news coverage and so forth. And obviously there's some really important trends that nobody can get away from in terms of increases in crime over the last couple of years, increases in cost of living related to inflation, and hitting on those themes. Meanwhile, as you got at, Governor Hochul was running something of a rose garden strategy, not really doing that much campaigning, raising tens and tens of millions of dollars and airing a whole bunch of ads. And then things have really shifted in the final weeks of the race, which is, I think, fairly good thing for voters to start having everybody really show a lot of sense of urgency on both sides of the aisle and trying to fight for those voters who might be swing voters or just really push their bases to come out. Say a little bit, Joe, on that piece, the sort of who's going to determine this election and how it's going to work. Republicans typically do very well upstate. The New York City suburbs are big battlegrounds. And then New York City, the Democrats dominate, but it's about percentages, and it's about who can do well where, and it's about who actually comes out to vote. So what are a couple of the keys there in terms of what this is going to come down to in the end?
Yeah, you hit on several key points there, Ben, because, if you look at the voter enrollment, and that's not, the be all end all, because like you said, it all depends on who turns out, right? But there are more independent lowercase I voters in New York than there are Republicans now.
No party affiliation.
Yeah, no party affiliation. So, so you talk about Democrats versus Republicans, and there's 2-to-1 Democratic enrollment edge in New York. But at the same time, you can't discount the millions of voters who are independent voters who are really going to swing this race. And it really is, it's funny, you look at a map of New York, even in the 2020 election, right? And Joe Biden won New York by 23 points. But you look at the New York map and it's almost exclusively red.
Right.
And you say, wow, I mean, even Rob Astorino or Mark Marinello in their races against Andrew Cuomo, they would say, they won 40 some odd of New York's 62 counties. The issue is the places that are blue is where the majority of people are. And so, so the question becomes, can Lee Zeldin, there's always this longstanding belief that a Republican, and this is what the George Pataki model was when he won 3 terms, can a Republican get over that 30% threshold in New York City, then carry Long Island strongly, and then do well upstate and win upstate as well. So, I mean, even in conversations with Zeldin, he's made no bones about it. He says he's got to get, if he doesn't get 35% in New York City, he's not going to get there. But
he has been remarkably focused on New York City, and that's clearly a campaign strategy.
It is, and perhaps more than you've seen out of other candidates. And so remember, like you said, Hochul has been on the job a little over a year. She'd be the first upstate governor in a century. So, I mean, she has to make inroads in New York City, and you see her crisscrossing the state, or crisscrossing the city to do that.
If anyone watching has any doubts about whether their vote matters, it matters. I mean, this election, listen, as you got at, Joe, this election still, as far as I'm concerned, could be Hochul by 12 or even 14 points or something like that. Could be. Doesn't seem likely at this point. It seems like it's a lot closer than that, but could be, because Democrats have such strong advantages in the state. But this could be a very close election. It's obviously the big statewide one, but there are other statewide, and then there's all of these legislative races. Whether you're in New York City, the suburbs, upstate, Western New York, et cetera, your vote really matters here.
Yeah.
And could impact the results of this race. I mentioned the ballot proposal that's statewide on the Environmental Bond Act. There's a lot of reasons to get out to vote. I'm interested in your perspective on this, and then we got to talk about a few other things, obviously. Sure. But there's this real interesting, sort of dichotomy here of juicing up base turnout and then also going after some of those swing, moderate, independent voters, suburban voters that, have sometimes gone Democratic, sometimes gone Republican. There's conservative and moderate Democrats who seem, at least a lot of them seem intrigued by Lee Zeldin. It's hard to say. There's some real interesting things there around leaning into the base. You have to juice the base, and then also trying to attract those middle voters. And I wonder how you see the sort of tension of that playing out. It seems a bit more tense for Zeldin, who really needs those swing voters.
It is. I mean, but New York City, I mean, we've had Republican mayors, it's not like, it doesn't happen. But yeah, it's interesting. So one of the things that, people you talk to and say, the fact that the race has tightened, in the end, will that help Hochul, right? Will Democrats say, wait a minute, I really do got to come out in this race, because it looks like it might be closer than I would have expected. So in other words, might have Democrats stayed home if the polls just continued to show Hochul up 15, now they're showing her up, single digits, let's say. Will Democrats, and Hochul's talked about this, will Democrats now be energized to come out and use their strength in numbers to put Hochul over the top? So that's going to be an interesting.
Has she given them enough? Not just the fear of a Zeldin win, but has she given them enough to, turn out to vote for her? I think is a very interesting.
Well, that's why you see the vice presidents coming on Thursday, Hillary Clinton. I mean, I wrote a story, Joe Biden's come to upstate New York twice in the last month. So and unions, others have come to her aid now in a way that they perhaps didn't even intend to a few weeks ago, and now are putting, much more money into her, mobilizing, doing the things that perhaps they didn't think they needed to do.
I think one of the biggest questions of this race, along with what we just got at it, and there's going to be, no matter what the margin is, unless Hochul winds up winning by 15, which seems unlikely, there's going to be a lot of questions, even if she wins by a narrow margin, a lot of questions about how her campaign ran this race, and especially, of course, if they lose. One of the other interesting things here is that you see Lee Zeldin, very conservative, very aligned with Donald Trump, who's unpopular in New York, doing better, at least right now in the polling we've seen, than expected. And it's this very interesting question of, is he doing that way because of this unbelievable, focus on these two issues, crime and the economy, cost of living, and really riling up so many New Yorkers who are frustrated about those issues and more coming out of the pandemic. And is he doing maybe better even than a more moderate Republican would have done, who would have been, probably talking about maybe a bunch of other things and really trying to appeal to some of those independent voters? It's a very interesting question I've been wrestling with about, Zeldin seems to be within striking distance. Would a more moderate Republican who, let's say, is pro-choice,
which Pataki was
better? Yeah, it's interesting, especially when we see the race coming down probably to the ability to swing some of these suburban voters who do go, both ways.
Just quickly on that, that has been what has been the Achilles heel for Republicans in these gubernatorial races. And it's like you see in any race, right? You have a primary, the conservative candidate wins the primary and then loses in a very blue New York, whether it was John Faso or, beating Bill Weld. I mean, you can go down the list of different races like that. So there was a theory, well, would Harry Wilson, let's say, who ran a primary and didn't do very well, more moderate pro-choice candidate, would he have done better? But like to your point, we'll see how it plays out here.
Yeah, and listen, no question that Zeldin is juicing up the Republican base like probably nobody else would have been able to do to the same extent. We'll see what turnout looks like. Again, there are a lot of those moderate and those independent voters who I think are listening to his message very closely, while Hochul's saying, hey, don't forget about abortion rights, don't forget about protecting democracy and some of these issues. All right, exactly. So Kathy Hochul is running with her lieutenant governor running mate Antonio Delgado. Zeldin's running with Allison Esposito, his running mate. Also statewide, we have a interesting attorney general race that we won't get into now, with Democrat Letitia James, the incumbent, seeking a second term against Republican Michael Henry. We have the state comptroller race, incumbent Tom DiNapoli, who's held the position since 2007, looking for another 4 years, against Republican challenger Paul Rodriguez. We have the statewide race for the U.S. Senate Majority Leader of New York, Chuck Schumer, seeking another term against Republican Joseph Pinion. A lot of similar dynamics in those races, but Republicans have put nowhere near the resources into those other candidates because they've so focused on the gubernatorial race. But there's a lot of to know about those races. You can find our coverage at Gotham Gazette and Politico. We won't get into those other statewide races right now. Let's get into the House races here. New York, as I said, 26 races going on. Somewhere around 10 or so of them seemingly very competitive. Joe, what's the landscape here? There's New York 11 in New York City, Staten Island and Southern Brooklyn. Republican Nicole Malliotakis took that seat from Max Rose 2 years ago. He's trying to take it back. Republicans feel pretty safe there, but it seems like the balance of power maybe nationally is going to swing on maybe that seat, but also New York races in the Hudson Valley, Long Island, and maybe one or two other parts of New York. Give us a little feel for what's going on in these House races in New York.
Yeah, it's funny, Ben. We had a story in September. The headline was, "Who will control the House? Look to New York." And it's proven to be pretty prescient because New York, if you look at the Cook report, they moved 2 Long Island House seats, 2 open seats. You have Kathleen Rice not seeking re-election, and Tom Suozzi ran for governor, so he's not seeking re-election. So New York has 5 toss-up races right now, if you look at the Cook report, and Politico has a similar forecast with similar results. So no state has more. You add those 5 plus another, 4 or 5 that are leaning one way or the other, and like you said, you get to about 10 races, let's say, that are really swing races that could very well determine who controls the House. And you wouldn't think blue New York would be the state that would determine that, but for all the issues that we just talked about, they're very tight races. You had redistricting that the Democrats were very aggressive in trying to gerrymander, got beat back. So now you end up with some more competitive races than Democrats would have hoped. And here we are with 3 key races on Long Island, several in the Hudson Valley. You have the John Katko seat in Syracuse. He's retiring. Very close race, toss up there. You have races in the southern tier, the Mark Molinaro seat. Mark Molinaro is running for an open seat against Josh Riley after Mark Molinaro lost the special election in August. That's a seat that runs from the Hudson Valley all the way to Ithaca. So you have candidates crisscrossing the state right now, all trying to get their final messages out. And I mean, it might be a late night.
Give us one race you're following. Again, I can't stress, a lot of the audience watching this obviously will be New York City based, but the stakes in these races all across the state, again, are so important for New York City. And again, as we're saying, across the country, people across the country, the races in New York could have a significant impact on their lives as well.
No question.
What's one race? I mean, there are so many, we won't dig into all of them now, but what's one congressional race here? I've focused a bit on the race with Sean Patrick Maloney, who's trying to keep a seat in Congress, but the districts have shifted a bit. And he's been the target of a real Republican effort to unseat him because he's the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. That's an interesting one in the 17th Congressional District in the Hudson Valley. What's one race that you're particularly, following or interested in that you want to highlight?
Yeah, well, clearly that's one, right? I mean, that was one. Sean Patrick Maloney won a primary pretty easily against Alexandra Biaggi, the state senator, who ran to his left. He beat her fairly easily. Now he's got to run against Mike Lawler, an assemblyman. So that's a key one. Another one I'll note is Pat Ryan, the Democrat who won that special election in August. A lot of people didn't think he was going to win that. It became like a bellwether on abortion. But again, the issue of abortion in August might not be resonating with voters the same way it is in October. So can he win a full term? That's the 18th district that runs through the Hudson Valley as well. Those are two key ones. Again, the open seats on Long Island, 3 of them. That's its own situation out there. Yeah. I mean, there are always toss-ups in Long Island.
Well, it's also an interesting case where on Long Island, you have to think the fact that the Republican gubernatorial candidate being from Long Island, specifically from Suffolk, is going to really boost Republican turnout there. That could be significant. Even though Lee Zeldin's leaving the House, whether he wins or loses here, he could help Republicans either take the majority or narrow it further, depending on how those Long Island races go. But so many of those are so, they're so individualized because these districts all have their differences. The candidates have their differences, the messaging, there's something to be said for the fact that there are national trends, of course. And we know that in a president's first midterm election, his party typically loses a whole bunch of seats in the House. But there's different things at play here. There is the issue of abortion that became, such a election year topic once the Supreme Court overturned Roe. So there's a variety of factors along with those long-term trends. And then there are the individual races. I think if we see some of these Republicans winning in typical Democratic strongholds in New York, that will be certainly this, a very big indicator of just a wave year for Republicans where maybe some of the candidates didn't even matter that much. We've seen that in the past for both Democrats and Republicans. Since we're getting low on time here, let's talk about the New York State Senate a little bit. Again, this is one where Democrats have made remarkable gains over the last couple election cycles to go from out of the majority to a supermajority in a very short time. That has matched a supermajority in the Assembly and a Democratic governor, whether Andrew Cuomo or now Kathy Hochul, for Democrats to pass a whole lot of priorities. I don't think anybody thinks that Republicans are going to retake a majority from just this election. Outside shot, they could. They'd have to win a whole lot of seats. What's the landscape in the state Senate here? What are you watching? And is there one race you want to just point to as something of a bellwether?
Yeah, one of the keys is whether Democrats will retain their supermajority. In other words, the ability to override vetoes of a governor, and in particular, if it's Lee Zeldin, then that becomes even more critical. But so there's that. But yeah, it's interesting. There's several key races. In fact, you don't see this very often. Incumbents versus incumbents in the Senate, and you have that in the Hudson Valley with Republican Senator Sue Serino in Poughkeepsie versus Democrat Michelle Hinchy That's going to be a very interesting one. Sue Serino is won in a swing district in many races, and another incumbent versus incumbent is up in Buffalo. Democrat Sean Ryan, he's going against Republican Senator Ed Rath in the same district. So,
and of course, again, Hudson Valley, Long Island, lots of swing districts, especially Long Island. I think with the state Senate, like the House, just really competitive races. Joe, from what you can tell, are the House races and the state Senate races, even though these are obviously different levels of government and there's some similar policy making at play and budgetary decisions, but very different in a lot of ways. Are they all sort of being fought on the same battlefield in terms of the issues? Are there any trends in House races that aren't quite there in state Senate, or vice versa? Or are we talking basically like these top 3 or 4 issues and
I know.
Democrats in power are the big themes?
Yeah, Democrats in power, right? One party control in Albany. You've heard Lee Zeldin even talk about that. And so there's that factor. The other one is, talking about crime, bail laws, the economy, very similar issues on all levels here. And again, we'll see what issues come to the fore on election day.
Right. I mean, that is really a lot of what we're talking about here is what matters more to voters, right? I mean, the distinctions are very clear. If anybody has been paying attention even at all, the major distinctions between Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin are very clear and very big in a whole number of issues. And, whether voters are more interested in, again, issues like protecting reproductive rights or, this general sort of commitment to democracy and not, propagating lies from Donald Trump and so forth, they might go towards the Democrats. If they're feeling like Democrats haven't had the answers on crime and inflation, they might go towards Republicans with a bit more nuance than that. I do want to highlight for people, especially in New York City, that because of redistricting, there are 2 basically brand new state Senate districts in New York City, and that reflects shifting population trends and how this redistricting undid some of the past gerrymandering that occurred that benefited Republicans in the state Senate. So there's 2 brand new state Senate districts in the city in District 17 and 59, 17 in Brooklyn, and 59 covers parts of 3 boroughs. You can find more information on that so people have a chance to elect some brand new people to the state Senate on those. Joe Spector is New York editor for Politico. Find lots of great work from Joe and his team and Politico writ large, of course, at Politico. Joe, thanks so much for joining me.
You bet, Ben. Thanks for having me.
And you can, of course, find our work at GothamGazette.com. And thank you for watching Decision NYC from Manhattan Neighborhood Network and Gotham Gazette. I'm Ben Max. Please do remember to vote and make your voice heard. There's a lot at stake for New Yorkers and our city, state, and country.